So, before we settle in, if you're finding your way to this story, take a second to like this video. It helps more than you know. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. It's completely free, and it means you won't miss where this long, winding road goes next. This is a story built for the curious, for the late-night thinkers, for anyone who's ever looked at something ordinary and wondered about the centuries of chaos and quiet that brought it here. So, wherever you are, let me know in the comments. Just drop a hello, your city, what time it is there. I love seeing the map of where everyone's tuning in from. Makes the whole world feel a little smaller, a little more connected. Alright, find a comfortable spot. Maybe dim the lights a little, and let's begin. Not with a king or a general, but with a leaf. A simple, green, stubborn leaf. We have to go back. Way back. Before history was something written down. Before empires, before money, before the idea of laws. We're talking about a time so distant, the world was a different color. The air smelled different. This was the Stone Age, and the name wasn't just for effect. Life was hard, sharp, and brutally short. People were figuring out the basics. How to make a pot that wouldn't crack in the fire. How to tell a wolf from a dog you could maybe befriend. How not to die from a scratch or a bad piece of meat. Survival was the full-time job, and the margin for error was vanishingly thin. Imagine the constant background hum of danger. The cold seeping into bones from a ground that never quite warmed. The gnawing uncertainty of where the next meal was coming from. In this world, every plant, every berry, every root was a question. Was it food? Was it poison? Was it something you could use? Now, picture a valley somewhere in what we now call Siberia. The wind cuts across the grasslands, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. A small group of people huddles around a fire, their world reduced to the circle of flickering light and warmth. The fire is life. Cooks, it protects, it gathers the tribe. On a night like this, maybe someone is tending the flames, feeding it with whatever burns. Dried grass, twigs, bits of bark. And maybe, just maybe, they toss on a handful of a particular plant they'd gathered. Maybe it was for the fiber, strong and long, useful for tying things. Maybe the seeds had been eaten earlier. The dried stalks go into the fire. Crackles, it smokes. The smoke is thick, aromatic, unlike the clean smell of burning wood. It has a scent that hangs in the air, earthy, almost sweet. Someone breathes in deeply, stoking the fire, and a wave of that smoke washes over them. What happened next wasn't a revelation. It was confusion. A sudden, profound shift in perception that had no name, no context. The world didn't change, but the feeling of being in the world did. The edges of the firelight might have seemed softer. The sounds of the night, the howl of a wolf, the crackle of the flame, might have taken on a new depth, a strange clarity. Or perhaps it was just a dizzy feeling, a lightheadedness that made the stars above seem to pulse. There was no word for high. There was no concept of recreation. For that person, that first accidental inhalation, the experience could only be interpreted through the lens of their world. Was it the breath of a spirit? Was the plant itself alive in some way they hadn't understood? Had the gods just whispered something directly into their mind? They forgot, perhaps, why they had stood up. They sat back down, watching the flames, feeling an unfamiliar sense of calm, or wonder, or just plain weirdness settle over them. That moment, lost to time, was the first domino. A domino that would topple through millennia. Archaeologists have given us clues that tell us this wasn't a one-off. They found cannabis seeds, tiny and ancient, placed carefully in burial sites from this prehistoric era. Think about that act. In a time when every resource was precious, when survival demanded constant forward motion, someone took this plant and laid it beside the dead. It was an offering, a companion for the journey into whatever came next. Was it sacred? Absolutely. Was it practical? Maybe they believed it provided comfort or sustenance in the afterlife. But the subtext is clear. This plant mattered. It held value beyond the physical. It had entered the human story not just as a tool, but as a symbol. That's a powerful start for a weed. For thousands of years after that first smoky breath, cannabis wasn't about philosophy or partying. It was about work. It was the duct tape of the ancient world. The fibers from its stalks, what we call hemp, were a miracle material. They were stronger than flax, more durable than most other natural cords. People figured this out fast. They twisted those fibers into rope. Good, thick rope that could tie down the hides of a shelter, that could secure a boat to a riverbank, that could lash together the frame of a cart. They wove it into cloth. It was rough, sure, tougher on the skin than soft linen, but it lasted. A hemp tunic could see a man through seasons of hard labor. It resisted rot, which was everything in a damp world. But the plant was generous. It offered more than just its body. The seeds were edible. Packed with oil and protein, they could be ground into a paste, sprinkled on other foods, eaten raw in a pinch. It was survival food. And the plant itself grew like, well, a weed. It didn't need perfect soil or constant attention. It just grew. So here you have this one species. You could eat its seeds, you could make clothes and rope from its stalk, you could use its oil. And then, if you were so inclined, you could take the leftover flowers and leaves, dry them, and, well, you remembered what your ancestors did around that fire. It was the ultimate multitasker. A Neolithic farmer looking at a field of hemp saw security. He saw nets for fishing, lines for hunting, bags for carrying, cloth for his family. His world, in many ways, could be built from this one crop. So, for centuries, this was the relationship. Pragmatic, respectful, quiet. Cannabis was a workhorse. But that other property, the one that came from the fire, never quite went away. It lingered in the background, a secret the plant held. People knew. Shamans, healers, the ones who walked the line between the physical and the spirit world, they likely experimented. They were the scientists of their time, testing the boundaries of consciousness with whatever the natural world provided. They would have discovered that this smoke didn't just make you feel strange. It could alter pain, could quiet a restless mind, could, in the right setting, feel like a doorway. But this knowledge was specialized, ritualistic. It wasn't for everyone. Not yet. This sets the stage for one of humanity's oldest and most complex relationships. We cultivated it, relied on it, built with it. And all the while, it had this other life, this hidden potential, waiting for the right moment, the right culture, to step forward and ask a different kind of question. Not what can you build, but what can you see? The plant's journey from the campfire to the center of global controversy starts here, in this dual identity. It was always both the builder and the dreamer, and humanity, being what it is, was destined to be fascinated by both. Let's jump forward in time. The scene changes dramatically. We're no longer in the windswept steppes. We're in the cradle of one of the world's first great civilizations, ancient China. The year is around 2700 BCE. The Stone Age is a fading memory. Here, society is a complex machine. They've mastered bronze, they're developing writing, they have bureaucracies and emperors. Order is the ideal. And into this world of structure and ritual steps, a legendary figure, Emperor Shennong. His name translates to the divine farmer, and his story is foundational to Chinese medicine. Shennong wasn't a ruler who just sat on a throne. He was a hands-on experimenter. The legend says he had a transparent stomach, so he could see the effects of plants as he ingested them. A more realistic view is that he, or more likely a school of thought attributed to him, was a fearless pioneer of pharmacology. Shennong's method was the ultimate trial and error. He is said to have tasted hundreds of herbs, carefully noting their effects. Some healed, some nourished, and some, inevitably, made him violently ill or even killed him. He was a one-man clinical trial, walking the knife's edge between medicine and poison to catalog the natural world for his people. It was an act of profound, reckless devotion. And among the many plants he documented was cannabis. He called it Ma. In the text attributed to him, the Shenong Ben Chao Jing, cannabis is recorded with clear, practical purpose. It wasn't listed under recreation or spiritual aids. It was a medicine. The text notes its uses for rheumatic pain, for gout, for menstrual cramps, for absent-mindedness. The irony of that last one wouldn't be lost on anyone today. It was prescribed to ease the mind, to calm what we might call anxiety or stress. But the context is crucial. This wasn't about smoking a joint. The Chinese method was ingestion. They brewed the leaves and flowers into bitter teas and tonics. They ground it into powders to be mixed with other herbs. They made ointments for external pain. The psychoactive effects were a known side effect, but the goal was therapeutic balance. In the framework of early Chinese medicine, which was all about balancing the forces of yin and yang in the body, cannabis was seen as a plant that could restore harmony, that could unblock stagnation, whether in the joints or in the spirit. At the exact same time, the other half of the plant, hemp, was becoming an industrial powerhouse. While the doctors were brewing their ma teas, the farmers were cultivating vast fields of it for fiber. Hemp was the plastic of ancient China. Its strong, resilient strands were spun into rope so vital it was considered a strategic resource. Think about that. The strength of your navy, the security of your cargo, the rigging of your ships, all dependent on the quality of your hemp rope. But it went further. Around this time, the Chinese pioneered the process of making paper. And one of the primary materials they used? Hemp fiber. The oldest surviving pieces of paper in the world, dating to the Han Dynasty, are made from hemp. So the very words of early Chinese philosophy, law, and poetry, the records of their civilization, were literally inscribed on cannabis. Your clothes could be made from it, your ships sailed by it, your pain treated by it, and your history written on it. You could quite literally live a life enveloped by this plant from birth to death. It was infrastructure, it was culture, it was medicine. This Chinese chapter is critical because it establishes the dichotomy that would follow cannabis forever. It was both utterly mundane and potentially profound. It was the rope in the dockworker's hand and the tincture in the doctor's jar. The ruling class and the scholarly elites saw its industrial value and its medical applications. The mystical Taoist monks, seeking altered states to commune with the Tao, the fundamental force of the universe, began experimenting with it in incense burners during meditation. They spoke of it opening the gates of perception, helping to free the mind from earthly attachments. But even this was framed within a spiritual and disciplined practice. It wasn't frivolous. Meanwhile, the Confucian scholars, who emphasized social order, ritual propriety, and clear-minded duty, likely frowned upon any substance that clouded judgment. They saw the value of hemp for society, but the intoxicating properties of ma would have been viewed with suspicion. It threatened the clarity and control they prized. So, even in 2000 BCE, the debate was alive. Is this plant a tool for healing and transcendence, or a potential agent of laziness and social disorder? China didn't resolve the question. It simply held both truths at once, using the plant for everything it was worth while quietly arguing about its soul. The plant itself didn't care. It just kept growing, its roots digging deeper into human history. Now let's travel west, out of the ordered river valleys of China and onto the vast, open grasslands of Central Asia. This is a world away from emperors and scrolls. Here, life is defined by the horizon, the horse, and the hunt. These are the Scythians. If the ancient Chinese were the meticulous librarians of civilization, the Scythians were the wild poets of the steppe. Nomadic, fierce, covered in elaborate tattoos, they lived in the saddle. They were master archers, feared warriors, and they buried their dead in spectacular kurgans, burial mounds, filled with gold. Their relationship with the earth was direct, unfiltered by bureaucracy, and they had a very different idea about cannabis. Around 1000 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus, the world's first great travel writer, described a Scythian funeral ritual as a vivid, unforgettable scene. After the burial, he writes, the Scythians would cleanse themselves. They would build a small, sealed tent, draping woolen felt over a frame of sticks. Inside this tent, they would place a bowl of hot stones. Then they would crawl inside, taking with them the seeds of the hemp plant. They would throw these seeds onto the red-hot stones. Instantly, the seeds would crackle and smoke, filling the enclosed space with a thick, fragrant, and intensely psychoactive vapor. Herodotus writes that the Scythians, inhaling this smoke, howl with joy. Let's unpack this. This isn't a medical tea sipped for gout. This is a full-sensory, communal, ritualized experience. The howl with joy is Herodotus's Greek interpretation of what was probably ecstatic singing, chanting, or vocalizing. A direct, physical reaction to an intense psychoactive experience. For the Scythians, this wasn't just getting high. This was a sacrament. The smoke was a purifier, a way to cleanse themselves after contact with the dead. It was a vehicle for communion with the spirit world, a means to transcend the grief of loss and celebrate the journey of the departed. It was spiritual hygiene, and it was intense. Archaeology has stunningly confirmed this. In Scythian burial mounds across modern-day Russia and Ukraine, excavators have found small, portable tents and elaborate gold vessels. And on the interior of these vessels, chemical analysis has revealed traces of cannabis and opium residues. These weren't just ceremonial bowls. They were functional, high-end equipment for the ritual. Imagine a nomadic chieftain being buried with his golden bong, a final piece of kit for the afterlife. It speaks to the centrality of this practice. For the Scythians, cannabis was a direct line to the sacred, a technology of ecstasy woven into their most profound cultural moments. This practice spread like gossip across the steppes. Other nomadic groups adopted it. The smoke ritual traveled along trade routes, moving south and west. It introduced a new method of consumption: inhalation. It also cemented an idea that would travel with the plant forever, that cannabis could be a tool for collective, euphoric, boundary-dissolving experience. It wasn't just about personal pain relief or quiet meditation. It could be about community, celebration, and roaring, joyful connection to something bigger. The Scythians didn't write treatises on it. They just did it. And in their howls of joy, they gave the plant a new voice, one that was wild, free, and utterly compelling. From the wind-whipped steppes of the Scythians, our story takes a turn south into the lush, philosophically dense world of the Indian subcontinent. By 1500 BCE, a sophisticated civilization was flourishing along the Indus and Ganges rivers. Here, spirituality wasn't an add-on to life. It was the framework through which all of life was understood. The universe was a divine play, and the goal was to understand one's place in it, to achieve liberation, moksha, from the cycle of rebirth. And in this deeply spiritual context, cannabis wasn't just adopted, it was deified. Cannabis appears in the Atharvaveda, one of the 4 sacred Hindu texts, as one of the 5 sacred plants. It is described as a liberator, a source of joy, a gift from the gods. And not just any god. The plant is intimately associated with Shiva, one of the principal deities of Hinduism. Shiva is the destroyer and transformer, the lord of yoga, meditation, and asceticism. He is also the lord of Bhang, the Hindi word for cannabis. Legend says that Shiva, after a family dispute, wandered into the Himalayas. He sat under a cannabis plant to meditate. The leaves fell on him, and he consumed them, finding in them a perfect calm and focus that aided his divine contemplation. From then on, cannabis became his favorite herb. This wasn't a secret or a vice. It was woven into the fabric of religious and social life. The most common form of consumption was bhang, a drink made by grinding cannabis leaves and flowers into a paste with spices like cardamom, saffron, and pepper, then mixing it with milk or yogurt. It was, and still is, consumed during festivals, particularly Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva. Devotees would stay up all night, singing hymns, chanting, and drinking bhang as an act of devotion. The line between spiritual ecstasy and psychoactive experience was not just blurred. It was considered the same path. The intoxication was seen as a sacred state, a temporary glimpse of the bliss of union with the divine. But its use was also wonderfully practical and social. Farmers would take it to ease the ache of a long day in the field. Laborers used it as a stimulant and painkiller. It was served at weddings and celebrations. A wandering ascetic, a sadhu, might use it to deepen his meditative trances. In India, cannabis achieved a holistic integration that no other culture quite matched. It was medicine, sacrament, social lubricant, and tool for labor, all wrapped into one, and all sanctified by myth. There was no stigma. It was simply part of life, a benevolent companion on the long, hard, beautiful road of existence. The Indian approach is so important because it represents the peak of cannabis's cultural acceptance. Here, for perhaps the only time in its long history, the plant was fully embraced for all its properties, practical, medicinal, and psychoactive, without major moral panic. It was seen as a positive force, a plant of the gods that brought joy, relieved suffering, and facilitated connection, both human and divine. It was a model of balance. Of course, even here there were discussions about moderation, about the difference between use for spiritual insight and abuse for mere stupefaction. But the fundamental attitude was one of reverence, not fear. It showed what was possible when a society made peace with this complex plant. It wouldn't last forever, but for centuries, in the temples and villages of India, cannabis was home. I'd love to hear what you think so far. Does this deep history surprise you? The jump from Stone Age campfires to Vedic rituals is a huge one, and we're just getting started. Drop a comment below, just the word history if you want. Let me know you're following along. It really helps. And if you're invested in the journey, please hit that subscribe button. The story is about to twist and turn through ancient empires, and you won't want to miss it. Now, our story flows westward again, following the natural currents of trade and conquest. The plant leaves the spiritual embrace of India and arrives in the ancient Near East, a crossroads of empires. Here, in the lands of the Assyrians and the Persians, cannabis encounters another kind of mind, the philosophical mind. The Persians, in particular, were builders of a vast empire and deep thinkers. Under the Zoroastrian religion, they pondered the cosmic struggle between good and evil, light and darkness. And into their world of fire altars and poetic inquiry came cannabis. The Persians didn't just use it, they intellectualized it. They called it kanab, a word that clearly echoes our modern cannabis. Mystics and philosophers began to use it as a tool for contemplation. The idea was that the smoke could quiet the chatter of the mundane mind, allowing deeper truths to surface. It was a mental solvent used to free the mind from doubt, as some texts suggest. In the royal courts and among the learned, It was discussed as a substance that could aid in achieving a state of serene clarity. Of course, as with anywhere, there was a shadow. The ruling classes grew wary. If people could find enlightenment or solace in a plant, what did they need priests and kings for? So began the ancient dance of simultaneous use and disapproval. It was respected in private philosophical circles, viewed with suspicion in public decrees. Yet, Persian traders were instrumental in the next big leap. They carried cannabis, in the form of potent hashish, a pressed resin made from the plant's trichomes, along the burgeoning Silk Road. This made the psychoactive element portable, durable, and even more potent. The plant was no longer just a local herb. It was a trade good, an idea packaged in resinous blocks, ready to travel. And travel it did. The Silk Road was the internet of the ancient world, a sprawling network of routes connecting China to the Mediterranean. Along with silk, spices, and gemstones, ideas, religions, and drugs flowed freely. Cannabis, in its various forms, was a passenger on every caravan. In China, it was paper and medicine. In the Central Asian caravanserais, it was the Scythian-style smoke for tired merchants. In India, it was sacred bhang. And now, pressed into hashish, it became a currency of its own. It moved into the Arab world, where it would encounter Islam and spark another chapter of complex debate. Before we follow it into the deserts of Arabia, let's take a quick detour south to the Nile. Ancient Egypt was a civilization obsessed with order, eternity, and the management of pain in a difficult world. The Egyptians were pragmatic healers. The Ebers Papyrus, a massive medical text dating to around 1550 BCE, lists cannabis as a treatment. Not for spiritual visions, but for very earthly problems. Inflammation, glaucoma, they described it as a cooling for the eyes, and yes, for a suffering of the womb. They even prescribed it for a painful finger or toe. It was a practical analgesic and anti-inflammatory. Egyptian women used it, too. There's evidence midwives employed cannabis preparations to ease the pains of childbirth. It was medicine, pure and simple, or was it? The Egyptians also had a powerful priestly class who managed the interface between the people and the gods. They used incense extensively in rituals. It's highly likely that cannabis, known for its strong scent, found its way into temple incense blends. The line between medicinal fragrance and psychoactive sacrament would have been thin in the smoky, sacred darkness of an Egyptian temple. And in a civilization so focused on the afterlife, cannabis made its way there too. Traces of it have been found in the tomb of Ramesses II and in the remains of other mummies. The idea was perhaps medicinal or ritualistic for the journey to the next world. Imagine preparing for an eternity of judgment and paradise, and making sure you packed something for the nerves. The Egyptians, in their way, covered all the bases. Now, let's cross the Mediterranean to the intellectual playground of ancient Greece. The Greeks, with their love of debate, wine, and questioning everything, were bound to have an opinion. And they did. The great historian Herodotus, whom we met earlier, wrote about the Scythians and their vapor baths, describing it with a mix of fascination and superior Greek amusement. Greek physicians took note. The famed Hippocrates, father of Western medicine, and later Dioscorides, a physician in the Roman army who wrote the definitive medical text of the classical world, both mentioned cannabis. They cataloged its use for earaches, inflammation, and edema. It was a plant in the pharmacopoeia, one among many. But did the Greeks use it recreationally? The evidence is scant. They had their symposia, drinking parties where men reclined, drank wine diluted with water, and discussed philosophy, politics, and poetry. Intoxication was from alcohol, and it was a social and intellectual ritual. Cannabis, likely seen as a foreign, barbarian practice, probably didn't feature much. However, given the Greek colonies along the Black Sea near Scythian territory, And the Greek fascination with altered states, the oracle of Delphi breathed volcanic fumes. After all, it's not impossible that some adventurous souls tried it. The philosopher Democritus, who spoke of the universe being made of atoms and void, reportedly experimented with various plants. Could he have tried it? We can only wonder. But overall, Greece's contribution was to document it, to bring it into the fold of natural history and medicine, treating it as a curious and useful herb from the edges of their known world. Then came Rome. The Romans were the great synthesizers and engineers of the ancient world. They didn't invent much, but they perfected and spread everything. Their relationship with cannabis was overwhelmingly practical. The Roman Empire ran on hemp. Think about the scale. An empire stretching from Britain to Syria with armies to supply, a navy to maintain, and a massive infrastructure to build. All of it required rope. Miles and miles of strong, durable, rot-resistant rope for ship rigging, for siege engines, for lifting stones in construction. Hemp was that rope. Roman sails were made of hemp canvas. The clothing of the legionaries, the sacks for grain, the tents, all often hemp. The plant was an unsung hero of Roman logistical might. Medicinally, the Romans adopted the Greek knowledge. Dioscorides' work, written in Greek, became a standard text in Rome. Cannabis was prescribed for the usual ailments. But the Romans, with their strict social codes and emphasis on disciplina, were deeply suspicious of intoxication that wasn't from wine. Wine was civilized, social, Roman. Foreign drugs were for foreigners, slaves, and deviants. There are hints, though, of its other uses creeping in at the margins. In the restive province of Judea, some scholars suggest certain ascetic Jewish sects like the Essenes might have used hashish-like substances in rituals. On the wilder fringes of the empire, in places like Thrace or among Germanic tribes, old Scythian-style practices likely persisted. The key Roman legacy was dispersal. As the Roman legions marched and built forts across Europe, they carried hemp seeds with them, planting them for local rope production. They established hemp farms in Gaul, France, and Britain. When the Roman Empire in the West finally crumbled in the 5th century CE, it left behind a continent dotted with fields of this useful plant. The knowledge of how to grow and process it remained. The psychoactive uses, however, largely faded into the background in Europe, preserved only in scattered folk traditions and the notebooks of a few monastic herbalists. The age of hemp as pure industrial material had dawned in the West, while its other life continued to burn brightly in the East. And it's to the East we must return, to follow the most dramatic and myth-shrouded chapter yet: cannabis in the Islamic world. As Islam spread from Arabia in the 7th and 8th centuries, it created a new cosmopolitan civilization that stretched from Spain to India. This was the Islamic Golden Age, a period of breathtaking advances in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. And into this world came hashish, carried by traders and Sufi mystics. The Quran explicitly forbids khamr, usually translated as intoxicants or specifically wine. This was clear. But what about hashish? It wasn't wine. It wasn't even mentioned. This created a theological gray area that would be debated for centuries. For the Sufis, the mystical, often ecstatic branch of Islam seeking direct personal experience of the divine, hashish became a controversial tool. Some Sufi poets and orders used it to break down the ego, to induce states of unity and visionary insight. They wrote verses praising it as a key to the Garden of Mysteries. To them, it wasn't an intoxicant that clouded the mind, but an illuminant that revealed hidden truths. The Orthodox religious establishment was horrified. They saw it as a clear intoxicant, a threat to social order and piety. They associated it with idleness, heresy, and the lower classes. Bans were issued. Caliphs and sultans outlawed it. But the bans were notoriously ineffective. Hashish dens, called Majun or Majlis al-Hashishin, proliferated in cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. They were places where people from all walks of life, scholars, merchants, laborers, gathered to relax, talk, and smoke. It was the medieval equivalent of a coffee house, but far more transgressive. It was in this volatile Persian context that one of history's most enduring and misleading legends was born: the Assassins. In the 11th century, a breakaway Shia sect known as the Nizari Ismailis, led by the charismatic Hassan I Sabah, seized the mountain fortress of Alamut in Persia. They were a small, militant group surrounded by powerful enemies. To survive, they employed targeted political murder, a tactic not uncommon in the region. Their enemies, seeking to demonize them, spread a story that Hassan I Sabah used hashish to control his followers. The legend said he would drug young men with hashish, take them to a secret garden filled with pleasures, a simulation of paradise, then tell them they could return to this paradise forever if they carried out missions for him and died as martyrs. These followers were called hashishiyin, hashish users. The story is almost certainly propaganda. There's no solid historical evidence the Nizaris used hashish operationally. It was a slur, a way to explain their fanatical devotion by attributing it to drug-induced stupor rather than genuine religious zeal or political conviction. But the label stuck. When European crusaders encountered these stories in the Middle East, they brought the terrifying tale home. The word hashishian morphed into assassin in European languages. And just like that, cannabis, in the form of hashish, was forever linked in the Western imagination with secret societies, murder, and Oriental menace. It was a catastrophic piece of PR, a stain of fear and exotic danger that would linger for 1,000 years. Back in Europe during the Middle Ages, unaware of the complex debates in the Islamic world, the relationship with the plant remained simple. Hemp was vital. With the fall of Rome, long-distance trade collapsed. Communities became self-sufficient. Every manor, every monastery, needed to produce its own cloth, its own rope, its own lamp oil. Hemp was a staple crop, often required by law to be planted by farmers. It was processed in homes and workshops. The fibers were spun and woven into a coarse, sturdy cloth called canvas, from the Latin cannabis. This cloth was used for sails, sacks, work clothes, and even the protective covers for knights' armor. The seeds were pressed for oil, used in lamps and for making soap and paint. Hemp was unglamorous, essential, and utterly mundane. The psychoactive properties were largely forgotten in mainstream Europe. They persisted in folk medicine. Grut, a herb mixture used to flavor beer before the widespread adoption of hops, sometimes contained other herbs, and it's possible cannabis was among them in some regions. Midwives and village wise women might have kept knowledge of its pain-relieving effects. But by and large, medieval Europe saw the plant as a fiber crop, not a drug. That would change slowly as Europe reconnected with the wider world. The turning point was the Age of Exploration, and it starts with a connection we often forget. When Christopher Columbus set sail in 1492 for what he thought was Asia, his ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, were floating on hemp. Their sails were hemp canvas. Their rigging was hemp rope. The caulking between their wooden planks was made with hemp fiber mixed with tar. The explorers' clothing, their sacks of provisions, even the pages of their logbooks, if they were cheap ones, could have been hemp. The European expansion that reshaped the globe was literally powered by this plant. And on his second voyage, Columbus brought hemp seeds to the New World, planting them in the Caribbean. The Spanish did the same in their colonies in South America. The Portuguese brought it to Brazil and their African trading posts. The English would later bring it to Jamestown. Everywhere European ships went, hemp went with them, first as a necessary supply for the ships themselves, and then as a cash crop for the new colonies. This global dispersal had an ironic twist. In the Americas, Europeans encountered indigenous cultures using their own psychoactive plants, tobacco, peyote, coca, various mushrooms. Yet, they showed little interest in the psychoactive potential of the hemp they themselves had brought. That interest would re-enter Europe from a different direction, through medicine and literature. By the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, European intellectuals were rediscovering the classical world. They read Dioscorides and Pliny. They also began to translate Arabic medical texts which spoke of hashish. In the 19th century, with the rise of modern chemistry and a fascination with Oriental exotica, cannabis captured the Western imagination in a new way. Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, 1798 to 1801, exposed French soldiers and scientists to hashish culture. They brought stories and samples back to Paris. In the 1840s, a young French doctor named Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours, believing mental illness was rooted in brain physiology, began experimenting with hashish on himself and his patients at the famous Salpêtre Hospital in Paris. He founded the Club de Hashishins, Hashish Eaters Club, which included literary giants like Théophile Gautier, Charles Baudelaire, and Alexandre Dumas. They met to take large doses of hashish and record their fantastical, often terrifying experiences. Baudelaire would later write Les Paradis Artificiels, Artificial Paradigms, a profound and cautionary essay on hashish and opium. For these romantic artists, hashish was a tool for breaking the chains of bourgeois reality, for accessing sublime and horrific visions. It was the key to the artificial paradise, a dangerous but seductive escape. This framed cannabis in the Western mind as a drug of artists, bohemians, and degenerates, a far cry from its sacred role in India or its medical role in China. It was exotic, intellectual, and deeply transgressive. Simultaneously, Western medicine was embracing it. In 1839, a brilliant Irish doctor working in Calcutta, William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, conducted rigorous studies on cannabis. He tested its effects on animals, then used tinctures to treat rheumatism, convulsions, and the agonizing muscle spasms of tetanus and rabies in patients at the Medical College of Calcutta. He published his results, proclaiming it a medicine of astonishing power. O'Shaughnessy's work ignited medical interest in Europe and America. By the late 1800s, cannabis tinctures and extracts were widely available in pharmacies across Europe and the United States. They were sold by reputable firms like Squibb and Park Davis for pain, migraines, insomnia, and female troubles. It was a standard, if minor, part of the doctor's toolkit. So, by the dawn of the 20th century, cannabis occupied three distinct spaces in the Western world. Industrial, hemp was still a major crop, especially for naval supplies. Medical, cannabis tinctures were legally sold in pharmacies. Recreational/bohemian, hashish was a known, exotic intoxicant of artists and a vague, feared Oriental vice. Thanks to the old assassin legends, this fragile equilibrium was about to be shattered. The forces that would lead to global prohibition were already stirring, driven by a mix of racism, economic competition, and a new, aggressive form of moral panic. But that's a story for another part. We've traveled a staggering distance together in this first part, from Siberian campfires to Parisian salons. We've seen this plant be a god, a rope, a medicine, a sacrament, a slander, and a muse. Its story is a mirror held up to humanity itself. Our need for utility, our search for transcendence, our fears of the unknown, and our endless capacity for both reverence and hypocrisy. This is just the foundation. The 20th century's war on this plant, its countercultural resurrection, the modern medical revolution, and the ongoing legal and social battles. That's where the story gets personal, where it connects directly to the world we live in now. It's a wild ride, and I hope you'll stay with me for it. So we left our story at a curious crossroads. It was the dawn of the 20th century, and in the West, cannabis existed in a kind of quiet, fragmented harmony. It was a plant with a split personality. In the fields, it was hemp, stalwart, agricultural, the stuff of sails and sacks. In the pharmacy, it was a tincture in a brown glass bottle, a remedy for sleepless nights and nagging pain. And in the shadowy corners of the imagination, it was hashish, an exotic vice of artists and a whispered legend from the Orient. This delicate balance was about to be obliterated. The story of cannabis in the 1900s is the story of how fear, money, and prejudice can rewrite history, turning a familiar plant into a public enemy. This is where the past crashes into our present. If you're just joining us, welcome. This is a deep, continuous story. You might want to go back and catch part 1, where we traced the plant's journey from Stone Age campfires to Victorian apothecaries. It sets the stage for everything that follows. And if you're already along for the ride, thank you. Take a second, if you would, to hit that like button. It's a small gesture, but it tells me this journey is resonating with you. All right, let's dive into the century that changed everything. Our story's first act of the 1900s begins not with a law, but with a migration. In the early decades, political turmoil and economic desperation in Mexico triggered a wave of immigration to the United States, particularly to the American Southwest and West. These migrants brought with them their language, their culture, and their customs, including the recreational use of marijuana, the Mexican Spanish term for cannabis. For these communities, smoking the plant was a normal social activity, no more remarkable than sharing a drink. But to white American society, it was alien, and in a time of intense nativism and racial anxiety, alien meant dangerous. Newspapers, especially the burgeoning tabloid press, seized on this. They began printing sensational stories that linked marijuana with violent crime, sexual deviance, and madness. The headlines were designed to terrify. Marijuana makes fiends of boys in 30 days. Or, loco weed drives users to murder. The narratives were almost always racialized. The supposed fiends were Mexican laborers or, later, black jazz musicians in cities like New Orleans and St. Louis. The drug was portrayed as a corrupting influence that could make these already feared minorities uncontrollable and violent towards white society. It was a perfect storm of xenophobia. The plant itself was merely the prop. The real target was the people using it. This racialized fear found a powerful and cynical champion in one man, Harry J. Anslinger. In 1930, with the repeal of alcohol prohibition looming, the United States government consolidated its drug enforcement efforts into a new Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger, a career bureaucrat with a sharp eye for self-promotion, was appointed its first commissioner. He saw his new agency facing a post-prohibition budget crisis. He needed a new public enemy to justify his department's existence. Alcohol was coming back, so he turned his focus to cannabis. Anslinger was a master of propaganda. He orchestrated a media blitz, feeding the press a steady diet of horror stories, many of them fabricated or wildly exaggerated. He famously testified before Congress, declaring, "Marijuana is the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind." He read from a collection of lurid crime reports he called his gore file, linking them all to cannabis, ignoring any other factors. His rhetoric was explicitly racist. In a memo to his field agents, he wrote, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races." This wasn't subtle. The campaign wasn't about public health. It was about social control, wrapped in the language of moral panic. Anslinger's crusade found its legislative vehicle in the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. The act didn't outright ban cannabis. It placed a prohibitively expensive tax on its sale and required an onerous level of documentation for anyone dealing in it, from doctors to hemp farmers. The effect was the same as prohibition. The bill was pushed through with minimal debate. At the congressional hearing, Anslinger was the star witness. The only opposition came from representatives of the hemp industry and the American Medical Association. Dr. William C. Woodward of the AMA pointed out there was no medical evidence to support the hysterical claims, and that the bill would cripple legitimate medical use. He was ignored, even ridiculed. The hearing famously featured a piece of evidence entered into the record: a shredded hemp doormat presented as a sample of the deadly marijuana. The level of scientific understanding was, to put it mildly, lacking. The act passed. Almost overnight, cannabis was effectively criminalized at the federal level. Medical tinctures vanished from pharmacy shelves. Research ground to a halt. The centuries-old medical knowledge was erased from mainstream practice by a stroke of a pen driven by fear and prejudice. But the story doesn't end at the U.S. border. Anslinger, ambitious and dogmatic, took his campaign global. As a powerful voice on the United Nations Narcotics Commission, he worked tirelessly to export America's prohibition model. He pressured other nations to adopt strict anti-cannabis laws, framing it as a necessary component of modern, civilized society. Through international treaties like the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the prohibitionist framework was cemented worldwide. A plant used for millennia across cultures was now globally classified as a dangerous narcotic with no medical value. It was a stunning historical rewrite. While Anslinger waged his war, another, quieter story was unfolding, one of sheer necessity. I want you to picture something. It's 1942. The world is at war. The United States has been cut off from its primary sources of hemp fiber, which came from the Philippines and other Asian territories now under Japanese control. Hemp was critical to the war effort. It was needed for parachute webbing, for the ropes and rigging on thousands of ships, for uniforms, for canvas. The U.S. military was facing a critical shortage. So what did the government do? It launched a massive national campaign called Hemp for Victory. The U.S. Department of Agriculture produced a patriotic film with that exact title, urging American farmers to grow hemp as a patriotic duty. They distributed over 400,000 pounds of hemp seed across the Midwest. They even granted draft deferments to experienced hemp farmers. The government that had, just years before, demonized marijuana was now actively paying farmers to cultivate thousands of acres of cannabis sativa. The irony was lost on no one, but necessity trumped ideology. For a brief, shining moment, the plant was a hero again. Farmers answered the call. They grew vast fields of it. The fiber was processed and sent off to win the war. Then, 1945 came. The war ended, just as suddenly as it had begun. The Hemp for Victory program was terminated. The government bought back the surplus seeds and destroyed them. The processing plants were shut down. The farmers who had invested in equipment were left holding the bag. And the old narrative, the Anslinger narrative, snapped back into place with a vengeance. Cannabis was once again just marijuana, the killer weed. The pragmatic, industrial chapter was closed, deliberately forgotten. It's one of the most hypocritical and fascinating twists in the entire saga. The plant was good enough to help save democracy, but was immediately relegated back to the shadows once the crisis passed. Now let's shift scenes. It's the late 1940s, moving into the 1950s. In the United States, conformity is king. The suburban ideal, the nuclear family, the clean-cut image, this is the cultural mandate. And into this world of tailfins and tract homes, a countercurrent was beginning to flow. It started in the marginalized spaces, the black jazz clubs of Harlem and Chicago, the hipster beats of San Francisco and New York. For musicians like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Charlie Parker, cannabis, they called it gauge or tea, was a creative lubricant. a way to unwind from the pressures of racism and the grind of touring. It was part of the culture. The Beat Generation writers Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs embraced it as a tool for breaking free from what they saw as the sterile, materialistic consciousness of mainstream America. They wrote about it openly. It was a sacrament of nonconformity. To the establishment, this was terrifying. The association of cannabis with these outsider groups, racial minorities, and rebellious intellectuals only reinforced its image as a threat to the social order. The stage was being set for the explosion to come. And explode it did. The 1960s. If the first half of the 20th century was about constructing the fear, the second half was about the rebellion against that fear. A perfect storm of factors collided. The civil rights movement challenging old racial hierarchies, the anti-Vietnam War movement challenging government authority, and a massive demographic bulge of young baby boomers coming of age. For this generation, cannabis became more than a drug. It became a symbol. It was a symbol of peace versus the establishment's war, of love versus its hatred, of mind expansion versus what they saw as mindless consumerism. The epicenter was, of course, San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, but the phenomenon was nationwide. College campuses, communes, and music festivals became places where cannabis was shared openly. It was the social glue of the counterculture. The music of the era, the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, either referenced it openly or was steeped in its aesthetic. The message was clear. Using cannabis was an act of political and personal liberation. It was a direct rejection of the Anslinger-era propaganda. Young people tried it and realized the hysterical warnings of murder and insanity were lies. This created a massive credibility gap. If the government had lied about this, what else was it lying about? This single realization eroded trust in authority for an entire generation. The establishment's response was a furious backlash. President Richard Nixon, elected on a platform of restoring law and order, declared a war on drugs in 1971. He explicitly framed it as a way to attack his political enemies. In a private conversation later revealed by his aide, John Ehrlichman, he said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." It was a cold, calculated political strategy. Cannabis was the perfect weapon. Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, in 1973, consolidating the drug war into a single, powerful agency. Mandatory minimum sentences were introduced. The rhetoric escalated. But a funny thing happened. Despite the escalating penalties, use kept rising. The cultural genie was out of the bottle. This is a good moment to pause and ask you, the person listening right now, does this history track with what you were taught or what you suspected? This shift from hemp for victory to just say no is a wild ride. Let me know in the comments, just a word or two. And if you're finding this narrative revealing, please do subscribe. We're about to get into the medical rediscovery, the dawn of the legalization movement, and the birth of the modern cannabis industry. You won't want to miss it. Now, amid the political and cultural firestorm of the 60s and 70s, a small but determined movement was focusing on a different angle: compassion. While young people were smoking for peace and love, a few were beginning to ask a very old question anew. What about its power to heal? The modern medical cannabis movement has many roots, but one of the most poignant starts with a man named Robert Randall. In the early 1970s, Randall, a young college professor in Washington, D.C., was diagnosed with glaucoma. The intraocular pressure in his eyes was destroying his optic nerves, leading him inexorably toward blindness. Standard medications had terrible side effects and were losing effectiveness. Facing a lifetime of darkness, Randall, through his own research, discovered historical references to cannabis treating glaucoma. Desperate, he began growing and using it. He found it was the only thing that reliably controlled his pressure and saved his sight. In 1975, he was arrested for cultivation. Facing years in prison, he made a historic decision. He used a medical necessity defense, arguing that he used cannabis to save his vision and that the government was depriving him of a vital medicine. His case went to trial. In a dramatic moment, his lawyer forced the government to produce its own research. It turned out, despite public propaganda, the U.S. had been funding a secret research program at the University of Mississippi, growing cannabis for studies. One of those studies, the government was forced to admit, showed cannabis effectively lowered intraocular pressure. The judge had no choice. In 1976, Randall became the first American legal cannabis patient in the modern era. The government was ordered to supply him with medical cannabis. This program eventually evolved into the Compassionate Investigational New Drug (IND) program, which supplied a handful of patients with federal joints until it was closed in 1992. Randall's victory was a crack in the monolithic prohibition wall. It proved, in a court of law, that cannabis had medical value, a fact the government's own research confirmed but its policies denied. His story inspired others. In the 1980s, the AIDS crisis created a new wave of medical necessity. Patients wasting away from the disease and the brutal side effects of early treatments like AZT found that cannabis could stimulate appetite, reduce nausea, and ease pain in a way nothing else could. In San Francisco, a group of activists, including Dennis Peron, began illegally distributing cannabis to AIDS patients, seeing it as an act of mercy in the face of a plague. Peron's partner, Jonathan West, died of AIDS, and the experience radicalized him. He launched a campaign to legalize medical cannabis in California. This grassroots, compassion-driven activism culminated in 1996 with California's Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act. Against all odds, and facing fierce opposition from federal and state law enforcement, it passed. For the first time since 1937, a U.S. state legalized cannabis for medical use. It was a revolution. The dam had broken. Other states followed: Oregon, Alaska, Washington. The medical movement transformed the debate. It was no longer just about recreation versus crime. It was about suffering patients versus an inflexible, cruel law. This frame was powerful. It humanized the issue. It wasn't about stoners. It was about grandmothers with cancer, veterans with PTSD, children with seizure disorders. This narrative began to change public opinion in a way the counterculture argument never fully could. But the battle was far from over. The federal government, under Presidents Clinton, Bush, and initially Obama, remained fiercely opposed. The DEA raided medical cannabis providers in states where it was legal, creating scenes of terrible irony. Federal agents with guns drawn, arresting caregivers serving terminally ill patients. The tension between state law and federal law created a chaotic, risky landscape. Yet the movement proved resilient. Every raid generated sympathy and political pushback. Parallel to the medical story, the scientific story was slowly restarting. The government's monopoly on research-grade cannabis, grown at the University of Mississippi, and the labyrinthine approval process through the DEA, FDA, and NIDA stifled studies for decades. But patient testimonials were overwhelming. The anecdotal evidence for conditions like chronic pain, multiple sclerosis spasticity, and chemotherapy-induced nausea was so strong it pressured the scientific establishment to look again. In 1999, a landmark report by the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine, commissioned by the White House, concluded that cannabis did have therapeutic potential and recommended more research. It was a cautious but official acknowledgement that the prohibitionist dogma was scientifically bankrupt. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, the threads of this story, the cultural rebellion, the medical movement, the slow drip of science, began to intertwine into a new reality. Public opinion polls started to shift. The generation that came of age in the 60s was now in positions of power. Their children had grown up with a more normalized view of the plant. The internet allowed people to share information and stories, bypassing the old gatekeepers of media and government propaganda. And then, in 2012, another earthquake. Colorado and Washington state didn't just legalize medical cannabis. They legalized it for adult recreational use. This was the full circle. It was no longer just medicine for the sick. It was an acknowledgement that adult use for pleasure or personal fulfillment was not a crime that warranted handcuffs and prison cells. The experiment began. Tax revenue poured in. Crime didn't skyrocket. Teen use didn't soar. The predicted societal collapse did not happen. Instead, a regulated, taxed, and tested industry began to emerge from the shadows. From there, the dominoes have continued to fall. State after state, from Illinois to New Jersey, Arizona to Virginia, has joined the legalization column, whether medical or recreational. In 2018, the U.S. Farm Bill legalized hemp, cannabis with less than 0.3% THC at the federal level, reviving the industrial plant and unleashing a boom in CBD products. The circle back to hemp for victory was complete, but this time driven by market forces, not war. And as I record this, we sit in a strange liminal space. Cannabis is legal for most Americans in some form, yet it remains a Schedule I drug at the federal level, in the same category as heroin, deemed to have no accepted medical use. This absurd contradiction is the living legacy of Harry Anslinger and Richard Nixon. It creates banking nightmares, tax inequities, and legal vulnerability for a multi-billion-dollar industry. The pressure for federal reform is now a roar, not a whisper. We've covered a century of chaos in this part. From racist fear-mongering to patriotic hemp fields, from countercultural rebellion to medical salvation, from a brutal drug war to the green rush of legalization. The plant has been a mirror for our deepest societal fears and our highest aspirations for freedom and compassion. The story is nowhere near over. The next chapters are being written now in legislatures, in research labs, in social justice movements seeking to repair the damage of the drug war, and in the living rooms of people discovering this plant as medicine for the first time. That's where we're headed next. But before we move on, I want to hear from you. What part of this modern history hits home? The hemp for victory hypocrisy? The story of Robert Randall? The political calculation of the war on drugs? Share your thoughts below. This is a community of curious minds, and your perspective adds to the story. And if you want to follow this all the way to the present day and beyond, make sure you're subscribed. We left off at the dawn of the modern era, with states beginning to legalize and a glaring federal contradiction hanging over everything. But to understand the full weight of the present moment, we have to step back and look at the human cost of the path we took. The story of cannabis in the 20th century isn't just about laws and culture wars. It's about millions of lives disrupted, families torn apart, and communities devastated. This is the shadow side of the green rush, and any honest history has to look it in the eye. The engine of this human tragedy was the set of policies we call the war on drugs. While cannabis was often the entry point, the consequences were profound. Let's talk numbers because they tell a brutal story. From the 1980s through the 2000s, arrests for cannabis possession skyrocketed in the United States. In recent decades, there have been over 8 million cannabis-related arrests. The vast majority, roughly 90%, were for simple possession, not trafficking or sale. That's 8 million people handcuffed, booked, and processed into the criminal justice system for having a substance that is now legally sold in stores across half the country. But the raw number only tells part of the tale. The real injustice is in the disparity. Despite using cannabis at similar rates, Black Americans have been nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for possession than white Americans. In some cities and counties, that disparity jumps to 8, 9, or even 10 times more likely. This wasn't an accident. It was the predictable outcome of policing strategies that targeted low-income urban neighborhoods, disproportionately communities of color, over college dorms and suburban homes. The legacy of Anslinger's racist framing lived on in policy and practice. An arrest is not just a night in jail. A permanent scar can mean the loss of a job, making someone unemployable in many fields. Can mean eviction from public housing. It can mean the loss of federal student financial aid. It can mean the suspension of a driver's license. For non-citizens, it can mean deportation. And for parents, it can mean the loss of custody of their children. A single arrest for a small amount of cannabis could cascade into a lifetime of lost opportunities, embedding poverty and marginalization. It created what activists call the permanent undercaste, people legally barred from full participation in society for a nonviolent offense. Then there's prison. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws, like the 3 strikes rules passed in the 1990s, could turn a minor cannabis offense into a life sentence. While fewer people are incarcerated for cannabis alone today than at the peak of the drug war, tens of thousands of Americans remain in state and federal prisons for cannabis-related crimes. Many are there for nonviolent, low-level offenses, serving sentences longer than those for violent crimes like assault or manslaughter. Their lives were effectively taken by the state for participating in a market that is now a multi-billion-dollar tax-paying industry. The moral absurdity is staggering. This is the soil from which the modern legalization movement had to grow. It wasn't just about freedom to smoke, it was and is about justice. As the legalization wave gained momentum in the 2010s, a critical question emerged. Who would benefit from the new, legal market? Would it be the communities that bore the brunt of prohibition? Or would it be wealthy, white investors with no criminal records who could navigate the complex and expensive licensing processes? The early returns were disappointing. States like Colorado and Washington, in their rush to set up regulations, created high barriers to entry. License application fees could run into the tens of thousands of dollars. Real estate requirements were stringent. The need for large amounts of upfront capital meant that the first players in the legal market were often well-funded corporations or entrepreneurs from outside the cannabis culture. Many of the pioneers who had taken the risks in the medical era, the growers and caregivers, often from impacted communities, were shut out. They had the knowledge but not the capital. The term green rush took on a bitter double meaning. It was a rush for money that left many of the original soldiers behind. In response, a powerful movement for social equity was born. Activists and lawmakers began pushing for provisions in new legalization laws to try to repair the damage. These social equity programs aim to do several things. Expungement, automatically clearing or sealing the records of people with past cannabis convictions. This is perhaps the most direct form of repair, allowing people to move on without the anchor of a criminal record. Licensing priority, setting aside a percentage of business licenses for applicants from communities disproportionately impacted by the drug war, or for people with past cannabis convictions. Access to capital, creating loan funds or grant programs to help social equity applicants overcome the financial hurdles. Reinvestment, directing a portion of the substantial tax revenue from cannabis sales back into the communities that were most damaged. Funding job training, youth programs, and community development. The implementation of these programs has been messy, uneven, and often frustratingly slow. Bureaucracy, legal challenges from powerful industry incumbents, and a lack of real funding have plagued many efforts. But the principle is now embedded in the debate. Legalization is increasingly seen as incomplete without these restorative justice measures. It's an acknowledgement that you cannot build a legal future on the wreckage of an unjust past without trying to clean up the wreckage. This brings us to the other great frontier of the modern story: science. For most of the 20th century, our understanding of how cannabis works was shrouded in mystery and stigma. That changed in the late 1980s and 1990s with a series of monumental discoveries. Scientists, primarily led by Dr. Raphael Mechoulam in Israel, who had first isolated THC in the 1960s, discovered a previously unknown system in the human body, the endocannabinoid system, ECS. This was a paradigm shift. The ECS is a vast network of receptors. CB1 and CB2 are the main ones, and naturally occurring molecules in our bodies called endocannabinoids. It's a master regulatory system, influencing nearly every physiological process. Pain, mood, appetite, sleep, memory, immune response, inflammation, and stress. It's essentially the body's way of maintaining internal balance or homeostasis. Here's the breathtaking part. The compounds in the cannabis plant, called phytocannabinoids like THC and CBD, are structurally similar to our own endocannabinoids. They can interact with this system. THC works primarily by binding to CB1 receptors in the brain, mimicking our own natural compounds and producing its psychoactive and therapeutic effects. CBD works differently, often modulating the system without directly binding, influencing things like pain perception and inflammation. This discovery provided the biological why. It explained why a single plant could have such a wide range of effects, from quelling a seizure to stimulating an appetite to reducing anxiety. It wasn't magic. It was biochemistry. The plant was speaking a language our bodies are built to understand. This scientific validation supercharged the medical movement. It moved cannabis from the realm of folk remedy and anecdote into the world of evidence-based medicine. Research, though still hampered by federal restrictions in the U.S., began to accelerate globally. Major studies have since confirmed its efficacy for conditions like chronic pain, one of the most common reasons for medical use, with many patients finding it allows them to reduce or replace opioid use. Chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Synthetic THC, Marinol, has been an FDA-approved treatment for decades, but many patients find whole plant medicine more effective. Multiple sclerosis spasticity. Sativex, a mouth spray derived from cannabis, is approved in dozens of countries for this. Epilepsy. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching and compelling evidence came with CBD. For children suffering from rare, devastating seizure disorders like Dravet syndrome, high CBD cannabis oil proved to be a lifeline when every other drug failed. Stories of children having hundreds of seizures a week reduced to zero turned parents into unstoppable activists and led to the first FDA-approved cannabis-derived drug, Epidiolex, in 2018. The medical landscape is now a patchwork of promising evidence and frustrating gaps. Veterans with PTSD report profound relief. Seniors with arthritis find they can garden again. Cancer patients endure chemo with less misery. But because of its Schedule I status, large-scale, gold-standard clinical trials in the U.S. are still incredibly difficult to conduct. The science is playing catch-up to patient experience, and it's a race against time for those who are suffering. And then there's the industry itself. What has emerged from legalization is one of the most fascinating and chaotic economic experiments of our time. From a clandestine, cash-only black market, a legitimate, if still federally illegal sector has erupted. It's a tale of two worlds. In green states, you can walk into a dispensary that looks like an Apple store with educated bud tenders, lab-tested products with precise cannabinoid profiles, and an array of options unimaginable a generation ago. Not just flowers, but vape cartridges, gourmet edibles from chocolates to infused beverages, topicals for localized pain, tinctures, and concentrates with names that sound like they're from a chemistry lab. This commercialization brings its own set of questions and controversies. Big Cannabis is here. Multi-state operators, MSOs, trade on Canadian stock exchanges, buying up smaller companies, aiming for national dominance the moment federal law allows. Their marketing strategies, bright packaging, potent products, social media presence, raise concerns about public health, especially regarding youth. The potency of today's flower and concentrates is exponentially higher than the cannabis of the 1960s. While this is good for medical patients who need strong medicine, it raises legitimate questions about the risks of high THC products for recreational users, particularly in terms of anxiety, psychosis risk for a vulnerable minority, and addiction potential. Cannabis use disorder is a real, if less common, phenomenon. The regulatory frameworks are a grand, ongoing experiment. How do you keep it away from kids? How do you label potency and dose, especially in edibles where the effects are delayed? How do you test for impaired driving when THC lingers in the body long after the psychoactive effects wear off? How do you ensure product safety from pesticides and molds? Each state is essentially a separate laboratory, trying to answer these questions with varying degrees of success. All of this national ferment is happening under the cloud of federal illegality. This creates a bizarre and often Kafkaesque reality. The banking problem. Because cannabis is still federally illegal, most national banks refuse to do business with cannabis companies, fearing prosecution for money laundering. This forces the entire industry to operate largely in cash, a dangerous and inefficient model. Armored cars deliver cash to pay state taxes. Employees are paid in cash. It's a robber's dream and an accountant's nightmare. The tax problem. Section 280E of the Federal Tax Code prohibits businesses trafficking in Schedule I substances from deducting standard business expenses. This means a cannabis dispensary can't deduct rent, payroll, or marketing costs. Their effective tax rate can exceed 70%, crippling profitability and stifling growth. The research problem. As mentioned, the Schedule I status and the government's monopoly on research cannabis makes rigorous clinical studies painfully difficult, leaving patients and doctors without clear guidelines. The pressure for federal change is now a roar from all sides. Patients, businesses, investors, and a majority of the American public. Reforms are slowly inching forward. The Safe Banking Act, which would open up financial services, has repeatedly passed the House but stalled in the Senate. There's talk of descheduling entirely or rescheduling to a lower category, like Schedule III, where drugs with medical use reside. But politics, as always, complicates everything. We are living in the middle of the third great act of the cannabis story. The first act was its ancient global integration. The second was its 20th century demonization and the devastating drug war. This third act is the unraveling of that war and the fraught, exciting, and uncertain birth of a new relationship with this ancient plant. It's a story of redemption and greed, of healing and new risks, of justice delayed and, we hope, justice finally arriving. There's a lot to process, and your perspective is a part of this story now. Does the social equity argument resonate with you? Are you skeptical of the big business angle? Amazed by the science of the endocannabinoid system? I read every comment you leave, and they genuinely help shape how I think about this ongoing history. So let me know below. And if you want to follow this story to its conclusion, looking at the global picture, the future of research, and where we might be in another decade, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We're not done yet. For decades, the international approach to cannabis was monolithic, shaped largely by American pressure through the UN treaties Harry Anslinger helped forge. The 1961 Single Convention, the 1971 Convention on Psychotropic Substances, and the 1988 Convention Against Illicit Traffic all cemented cannabis as a dangerous narcotic to be suppressed. Nations that had their own ancient relationships with the plant, like India with its bang, or Jamaica with its spiritual ganja culture, were forced to criminalize under threat of economic sanctions. It was a form of cultural imperialism, erasing local traditions in the name of a global war. But the foundation of that global consensus began to crack with a thunderous sound. Canada. In October 2018, Canada became the first major world economy and the second country overall after Uruguay to fully legalize cannabis for adult recreational use nationwide. This wasn't a quiet policy shift. it was a strategic earthquake. Canada did it through a public health framework, aiming to protect youth, displace the illicit market, and ensure safe, regulated access. Their model includes strict packaging and marketing rules, a mix of private retail and government-run sales, depending on the province, and a commitment to medical access. The impact was immediate and profound. Billions in tax revenue, thousands of jobs, a legitimized, publicly traded industry that attracted global investment. Canada proved to the world that a G7 nation could legalize without descending into chaos. It gave political cover to other nations considering the same path. The dam was broken. South of the border, Mexico has been on a parallel, legally mandated journey. In 2018, its Supreme Court ruled that the prohibition of personal cannabis use was unconstitutional, violating the human right to free personal development. The court gave the government a deadline to legislate a new regulatory framework. After years of political wrangling, Mexico now stands on the precipice of creating what could be the world's largest legal cannabis market by population. The motivation there is starkly different: to cripple the powerful cartels that have torn the country apart with violence. The hope is that by bringing cannabis into the legal economy, they can sap a key revenue stream from organized crime. Its legalization as a tool for national security and peace, a powerful and tragic rationale born from a devastating drug war. Crossing the Atlantic, the story in Europe is a fascinating patchwork of decriminalization, medical access, and cautious social clubs. The Netherlands, with its famed coffee shops, has long had a Gedegen tolerance policy, where sale in licensed shops is tolerated but large-scale production and supply remain illegal, a paradox that creates a backdoor problem. Portugal famously decriminalized all drug possession in 2001, treating it as a public health issue rather than a criminal one, with dramatic success in reducing overdoses, HIV rates, and drug-related crime. Germany, Europe's economic powerhouse, is now moving decisively. After forming a new coalition government in 2021, it committed to legalizing cannabis for adult use, with plans focused on quality control, youth protection, and undermining the black market. When Germany goes legal, it will likely force a continent-wide reckoning through the EU's open border policies. But perhaps the most significant and underreported revolution is happening in the laboratories and pharmacies of Israel. For historical and political reasons, Israel became the world's epicenter for cannabis research. Pioneered by Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, the father of cannabis research, who isolated THC and CBD and discovered the endocannabinoid system, Israel fostered a unique environment where government, military, and academic institutions collaborated on cannabis science free from the hysteria that stifled it in the West. Israel has a robust, long-standing medical cannabis program and is a global leader in agri-tech, applying those innovations to cannabis cultivation. They are developing new strains for specific medical conditions, advanced extraction technologies, and delivery systems. The knowledge flowing from Israeli labs is fueling the medical and scientific revolution worldwide. Now let's talk about the quieter, but equally profound, global player, hemp. The 2018 U.S. Farm Bill didn't just change American agriculture. It sent a shockwave through the world. By federally legalizing hemp, cannabis with less than 0.3% THC, it unleashed a tsunami of investment in a plant with staggering potential. This isn't your grandfather's rope-making hemp. This is about bioremediation, using hemp to pull toxins from contaminated soil, sustainable textiles as an eco-friendly alternative to cotton and synthetics, hempcrete for carbon-negative building materials, bioplastics that decompose, and of course, the CBD market. The global hemp market is projected to explode into the tens of billions of dollars, positioning this ancient plant as a cornerstone of a potential green economy. It's the ultimate comeback. The plant that won World War II might just help us build a sustainable future. This whirlwind global tour shows one thing clearly. The monolithic war on drugs model is collapsing. In its place is a messy, varied, but unmistakable global movement toward regulation, medical access, and in many cases, full legalization. The question is no longer if the world will change its relationship with cannabis, but how. This brings us squarely to the most important frontier of all, the future. And to understand that future, we have to look at three interconnected spaces: the lab, the courtroom, and the culture. First, the laboratory. The future of cannabis is personalized and pharmaceutical. The one-strain-fits-all approach is fading. Researchers are now delving into the entourage effect, the theory that the full spectrum of the plant's compounds, hundreds of cannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids, work together synergistically, producing effects greater than any single compound alone. This is leading to craft cannabis and targeted breeding. Scientists are developing strains with specific cannabinoid and terpene profiles designed for distinct outcomes. A strain high in the cannabinoid THCV for appetite suppression and energy, another rich in the terpene linalool for anxiety relief, another with a specific CBD2-THC ratio for neuropathic pain without strong psychoactivity. Beyond the plant itself, the future is in synthesis and biosynthesis. Companies are now using yeast and other microorganisms to biosynthesize rare cannabinoids, like CBG, CBN, THCV, in fermenters, creating pure, consistent, and sustainable compounds without needing to grow acres of plants. Others are developing water-soluble cannabinoids for faster-acting, more predictable beverages. Pharmaceutical companies are creating synthetic analogs and novel molecules that target the endocannabinoid system with precision, hoping to capture the therapeutic benefits without the high. The plant is becoming a blueprint for a new generation of medicines. Second, the courtroom and the legislature. The future here is all about federal resolution in the U.S. and international treaty reform. The current state-level patchwork is unsustainable. The pressure will force one of several outcomes: descheduling, removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act entirely, treating it like alcohol or tobacco. This is the cleanest break and the goal of most advocates. Rescheduling, moving it to Schedule 3 or lower, which would recognize medical use, ease research restrictions, and allow normal business deductions, killing 280E, but would still keep it under FDA control as a prescription drug, potentially complicating adult use markets. The Safe Banking Act. This could pass as a standalone, finally allowing the industry access to banks, credit cards, and Wall Street investment, unleashing massive capital and growth. Globally, nations pushing against the UN drug treaties are forcing a conversation about modernization. The treaties are becoming obsolete, and pressure is building to amend them or for countries to simply withdraw from the cannabis-related sections, as Canada and Uruguay have effectively done. The goal is national sovereignty over drug policy. Finally, the culture. This is perhaps the most subtle and powerful shift. We are witnessing the normalization of cannabis. It's moving from the counterculture to the culinary culture, with infused fine dining, the wellness culture with CBD in everything from skincare to sleep aids, and the professional culture, where executives might use a low-dose microedible for creativity instead of a third glass of wine. The archetype of the stoner is being replaced by the image of the patient, the connoisseur, the wellness enthusiast, and the entrepreneur. But this normalization brings profound questions. Corporate capture is a real threat. Will a handful of giant corporations, akin to big tobacco or big alcohol, come to dominate the market, prioritizing profit over public health with potent, addictive products and targeted marketing? Social equity remains the unfinished business. Will the communities that were targets of the drug war be owners in the new economy, or merely its lowest-paid employees? Medical integrity is at stake. Will the wellness trend dilute the seriousness of cannabis as a medicine, or will it help destigmatize it further? And we must be honest about risks. As potency increases, so does the potential for cannabis use disorder, which affects about 10% of users. The link between high THC use and the onset or worsening of psychosis in a genetically vulnerable minority is a serious public health concern that requires honest education, not fearmongering. Impaired driving needs a reliable, universally accepted testing method. These aren't reasons to recriminalize. They are reasons to regulate wisely, to fund public education, and to continue research. I want to pause here and ask you right now, what does the future look like from where you sit? Does the global shift surprise you? Are you excited by the medical innovations? Or wary of big business moving in? Your perspective is crucial. Drop a comment, just a word or two on what you think the next decade holds. This is a living history, and you're a part of it. And if you want to stay with me as we continue to follow these threads, please do subscribe. We are at a remarkable inflection point in a story that is over 10,000 years old. The plant has been a constant. It is we who have changed. We've gone from seeing it as a spirit, to a tool, to a medicine, to a devil, and now to something in between. A commodity, a treatment, a pastime, a political football, and a symbol of a changing world. The arc of this history, though long and twisted, bends toward a kind of reconciliation. We are slowly, messily, moving back toward a relationship that resembles the ancient one of use and respect, but now with the complicating factors of modern science, global capitalism, and hard-won lessons about justice. We are not returning to the innocence of the Stone Age forager or the Vedic devotee. We are moving forward, carrying all the baggage of the 20th century, trying to build something better. The ultimate lesson of this entire saga might be this: cannabis is a mirror. It showed ancient humans the divine. It showed empires their logistical needs. It showed 20th century America its deep-seated racial fears and its appetite for social control. And now it is showing 21st century society who we want to be. Do we want a future of inclusive opportunity, of healed bodies and minds, of sustainable industry, or one of new monopolies, overlooked harms, and repeated injustice? The plant doesn't care. It will grow. It will produce its compounds. It will wait for us to decide. Our journey with it is a testament to human complexity, our capacity for wonder, for cruelty, for healing, and for change. This isn't just the story of a weed. It's a story of us. Thank you for listening this far. This concludes our 3-part deep dive into the epic history of cannabis. But the story never really ends. It will continue in the research papers, the voting booths, the boardrooms, and the quiet moments of relief for a patient in pain. Stay curious. If you've enjoyed this narrative, please share it with one other person who might find it fascinating. It's Rome, 1492. The air is thick with the smell of decay and ambition. Sewers run open in the streets, carrying filth towards the Tiber. The grand monuments of the Caesars stand as crumbling reminders of a power long gone, now surrounded by a warren of cramped, shadowy alleys. This is not the Rome of noble senators and stoic philosophers. This is the Rome of the Renaissance papacy, a dizzying mix of sublime artistic patronage and brutal, bare-knuckle politics. It's a city where a man can be consecrated as Christ's vicar on earth in the morning and order an assassination before dinner. And into this perfect storm of piety and corruption arrives a new pope, Rodrigo Borgia, who takes the name Alexander VI. Rodrigo was not a humble man. A cardinal from the powerful Spanish Borgia family, he had spent decades in Rome mastering the only true art of the Vatican, the art of the deal. His election to the papacy was itself a masterpiece of bribery, promise, and intimidation. When he ascended to the throne of St. Peter, he didn't see a spiritual office. He saw the ultimate vehicle for dynastic ambition. He had children, several of them, from various mistresses, which was scandalous but not unheard of for a Renaissance cardinal. But as Pope, he intended to turn those children into princes. This was his fatal, brilliant, and terrifying project: to transform the spiritual authority of the papacy into a secular, hereditary empire for the House of Borgia. And at the heart of this project, as both its most precious pawn and its most clever player, was his daughter, Lucrezia Borgia. To understand the Borgia myth, you must understand Lucrezia. She has been painted by history as the ultimate femme fatale, a beautiful, cunning poisoner, a participant in incestuous orgies, a woman who wore a hollow ring to dispense arsenic into the wine cups of her enemies. But to see only the myth is to miss the real, far more compelling story. The story of a woman navigating a cage of gilded venom, using the only tools she had, her wit, her grace, and her profound resilience, to survive. She was born in 1480 into a world where high-born women were currency. Their value lay in their lineage and their ability to forge alliances through marriage. By the age of 11, Lucrezia was already betrothed for the first time. The engagement was broken when a better political opportunity arose. This would be the pattern of her youth. She was a living treaty, her hand in marriage a signature on a diplomatic document. At 13, she was married to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a union meant to tie the Borgias to the powerful Sforza family of Milan. The marriage was a political shell. When the Sforza alliance became inconvenient, the Borgias needed a way out. They chose the nuclear option. They declared the marriage had never been consummated, demanding an annulment. Giovanni, humiliated and furious, refused. In retaliation, he spread the rumor that would haunt Lucrezia forever: that the real reason the Pope wanted the marriage dissolved was because he himself was having an affair with his daughter. The charge of incest between Pope Alexander VI and Lucrezia is the darkest stain on her legend. There is no credible evidence for it. It was the brutal, standard-issue slander of the time, the most damaging accusation one could level against a woman. But it stuck because it fit a narrative people wanted to believe about the corrupt, decadent Borgias. The annulment eventually went through, with Giovanni caving under pressure. Lucrezia, barely a teenager, was now freed, but her reputation was in tatters. She was both a victim of her family's ruthless pragmatism and collateral damage in their war for respectability. Her father, undeterred, immediately negotiated a new marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, the illegitimate son of the King of Naples. He was handsome, young, and by all accounts, Lucrezia's first and perhaps only experience of genuine affection in an arranged marriage. For a brief period, there was happiness. She had a son, named Rodrigo after her father. But in the Borgia universe, happiness was a fleeting vulnerability. The political winds shifted again. The alliance with Naples soured. Lucrezia's brother, Cesare Borgia, the real engine of the family's military and political might, saw Alfonso as a liability. What happened next is a masterclass in Renaissance terror. One summer evening in 1500, as Alfonso walked down the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, hired assassins set upon him. He was stabbed multiple times but survived, badly wounded. While he lay recuperating in his chambers in the Vatican, in the papal palace itself, a second team of attackers entered. They strangled him in his bed. The murder was brazen and open secret. The whispers in Rome were deafening. Cesare had ordered it. Some even whispered that Lucrezia, heartbroken or perhaps politically calculating, had been complicit. Again, evidence is absent, but the suspicion became part of her story. Imagine the scene. A young woman, twice married, once widowed by violence, living in the very heart of power, surrounded by the men who killed her husband. Her grief was likely real, but it was also a luxury she could not afford to display for long. Survival meant composure. At this point, the Borgia project was reaching its zenith. Cesare, with his father's papal armies and treasury behind him, was carving out a personal duchy in central Italy, a kingdom he intended to rule. And Lucrezia was needed for one more grand alliance. In 1501, at the age of 21, she was married to Alfonso d'Este, the heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. This was her escape from Rome, but it was not an escape from politics. Ferrara was one of the most prestigious and cultured courts in Italy. The Este family was ancient, refined, and deeply suspicious of this notorious Roman bride with her baggage of scandal and blood. Lucrezia arrived in Ferrara with a dowry of immense wealth and a reputation that could curdle milk. The Ferrarese court looked at her as a sort of beautiful viper, expecting poison rings and midnight intrigues. What they got instead was a revelation. Lucrezia Borgia, the alleged monster, proved to be a woman of extraordinary intelligence, diplomacy, and cultural sophistication. She mastered the difficult local dialect. She became a generous patron of poets and artists, turning the Ferrara court into a brilliant center of the Renaissance. She corresponded with the great thinkers of the day. She managed the duchy's affairs with skill when her husband was away at war. She bore children and navigated the complex politics of her new family with grace. In Ferrara, Lucrezia performed the most astonishing alchemy. She rehabilitated herself. She went from being the Pope's scandalous daughter to being the respected Duchess of Ferrara. She did not do this by confronting her past. She did it by outliving it, by building a new life of such palpable dignity that the old rumors began to sound crude and ridiculous in the face of her steady competence. She became a figure of piety, known for her charitable works. The woman once accused of orgies was now a devoted mother and a prudent ruler. But the Borgia tide was turning. In 1503, Pope Alexander VI died suddenly, possibly of malaria, though rumors of poisoned wine intended for someone else immediately swirled. With his death, the family's power imploded. Cesare, his military genius now useless without papal funding and authority, was captured, imprisoned, and eventually died in a minor skirmish in Spain. The Borgia name became synonymous with cursed ambition. Lucrezia, however, was now an Este. Safely ensconced in Ferrara, she was insulated from the total ruin of her birth family. She lived on for another 16 years, a beloved duchess, a patron of the arts, a central figure in the Italian Renaissance. When she died in 1519 after childbirth, she was mourned sincerely by her adopted city. She was buried with the honors of a Este princess, not a Borgia temptress. So why does the myth of the evil Lucrezia persist? Because it's a better story. The Renaissance loved dramatic contrasts, angelic beauty hiding a diabolical heart. The Protestant reformers, who hated the corrupt papacy, seized on the Borgias as the perfect example of Catholic depravity. Playwrights and novelists, from Victor Hugo to modern television producers, have amplified the legend because it sells. Sex, power, poison, and incest are more thrilling than a story of a smart woman surviving a brutal system through quiet diplomacy and cultural patronage. But the truth is more powerful. Lucrezia Borgia's life is a testament to the human capacity for reinvention. It shows us that in an era where women had almost no agency, where they were traded like property, one could still carve out a sphere of influence through intelligence and sheer force of character. She was a product of her family's monstrous ambition, but she was not merely its creature. She learned its lessons: ruthlessness, strategy, the importance of image, and then used them to build something lasting and legitimate for herself, far from its toxic epicenter. Her story is a mirror, much like the Cannabis story, but it reflects a different facet of humanity. It shows our lust for sensational sin, our eagerness to believe the worst about the powerful, and our frequent blindness to the more nuanced, resilient truth of a person, especially a woman, navigating a world designed to break her. Lucrezia Borgia didn't need poison rings. Her survival was her ultimate victory, and her legacy in Ferrara's art and culture is her real, unerasable mark on history. I hope you're enjoying this shift into a purely human drama, away from the botanical and into the psychological heart of the Renaissance. Does this kind of character-driven history intrigue you? The clash of myth and reality? Let me know in the comments. Just drop the word Borgia if you're following along. It helps build this community of the curious. Picture it. Rome, 100 AD. The city is a chaotic, vibrant, stinking metropolis of over 1 million souls. And on a race day, a significant portion of them are all flowing in one direction, towards the valley between the Palatine and Aventine hills. The Circus Maximus isn't a stadium as we think of it. It's a geological feature turned into a spectacle. It's a vast, elongated bowl, over 600 meters long and 140 meters wide. Its wooden and stone tiers could hold, by some estimates, 250,000 people. That's more than the Colosseum, more than any modern sports arena. It is the single largest venue for public entertainment ever built by human hands. On race day, the city's normal hum is replaced by a gathering frenzy. From before dawn, the streets are packed. Senators in their togas are carried in litters by slaves, parting the crowds. Merchants, soldiers, bakers, prostitutes, slaves, and freedmen. Every social stratum of Rome, from the highest to the lowest, presses together, united by a single burning desire to see the races. The air smells of sweat, cheap wine, fried sausages, and the pungent, animal scent of the stables. Excitement is a tangible, crackling force. This is where Rome comes to feel like Rome. You don't just go to the circus as a neutral observer. You belong. Your identity is tied to a color. Red, white, blue, or green. These weren't just team colors. They were factions, corporations, almost religious cults. You were born into your faction, you married within its social network, you lived and died for it. The whites and reds were older, often associated with tradition. The blues and greens were the giants, the arch-rivals who commanded fanatical loyalty. The greens were often the people's favorite, backed by the merchant classes. The blues were the team of the establishment, the senators, the emperor's favorites. Supporting a faction was a political statement, a social marker, a core part of your being. Men would get into bloody street brawls over an insult to their color. Women were known to leave husbands who supported a rival. This was fandom as tribal warfare. The factions were massive, sophisticated businesses. They owned the stables, bred the horses, trained the drivers, and employed an army of veterinarians, grooms, mechanics, and even spies. They were run like military operations. The horses were the true stars, imported from Spain, North Africa, and Greece. They were worth small fortunes. The charioteers, the origi, were the gladiators of this arena. Most started as slaves, bought young for their agility and fearlessness. The lucky, talented few could win their freedom and accumulate wealth beyond the dreams of most senators. But it was a short, brutal career. The average charioteer died before the age of 25. Let's meet one. Imagine a young man, perhaps from Greece or Thrace, lean and wiry. His body a map of old fractures and whip scars. He's been training since he was a boy, learning to control a quadriga, a chariot pulled by 4 horses. The reins are wrapped around his waist. This is critical. It gives him control, anchoring him to the team, but it also means if he falls, he will be dragged and trampled unless he can cut himself free with the dagger he carries in his belt. He wears the tunic of his faction, maybe the green. He's praying not to any major god, but to the personal spirit of his lead horse, or to a small statue of the goddess Fortuna he keeps in the stable. His life is measured in laps. Now the ceremony begins. A grand procession, the pompa circensis, winds its way onto the sand. Priests, musicians, statues of the gods on litters, and the charioteers themselves, greeted by a deafening roar from their supporters. The presiding magistrate takes his place. The lots are drawn to assigned starting gates. The tension is unbearable. Then silence. The magistrate drops a white cloth, the mappa, and chaos erupts. 12 chariots burst from the starting gates, a blur of color, muscle, and dust. The noise is apocalyptic, a physical wave of sound from the crowd, the clatter of wheels, the driver's shouts, the snap of whips. They race down the long straight, hurtling towards the first turn. The track circles a central spina, a long, narrow divider adorned with obelisks, statues, and shrines. At each end are the turning posts, the midi. This is where races are won, lost, and where men die. The turn is an act of suicidal precision. The chariot leans on 2 wheels. The driver has to slow his inside horses and urge his outside horses faster, swinging the chariot around the post in as tight an arc as possible. The goal is to kiss the meta, to come within inches. Do it perfectly and you gain a crucial length. Clip it, and you and your team become a tangled, screaming wreck, a naufragium, a shipwreck. The crowd doesn't gasp in horror. It roars in ecstatic fascination. Death is part of the spectacle. Attendants run onto the track to clear the wreckage and bodies with hooks, as the remaining chariots thunder past, using the carnage as an obstacle to block their rivals. 7 laps, each marked by the removal of one of 7 carved dolphins or eggs from the spina. The crowd counts them down, the frenzy mounting. The drivers are coated in a paste of sand, sweat, and blood. Their muscles scream. The horses' mouths are flecked with foam. In the final stretch, it's a flat-out sprint, a test of raw speed and endurance. When the winner crosses the line, the explosion from his faction's supporters is like a volcanic eruption. The victor makes a lap of honor, palms raised. His faction's fans are weeping, screaming, tearing their clothes in joy. The losers are met with a torrent of booze and thrown garbage. But the race is only the surface. Let's look deeper at what the Circus Maximus really was. It was Rome's political barometer. The emperor always had a box here, the pulviner. He wasn't just watching races, he was watching his people. The cheers and boos of the crowd were direct feedback, the ancient equivalent of approval ratings. A popular emperor would be cheered when he appeared. An unpopular one could be met with stony silence or, worse, chants and demands about bread prices or taxes. The crowd could, and did, use the races as a platform to shout grievances. It was one of the few places where the plebs could speak directly to power, and power had to listen. To keep them happy, emperors showered them with gifts during the games. Tokens for food, lottery tickets, even birds that would fly over the crowd with prize tags on their legs. This was the core of Juvenal's famous phrase, Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't revolt. The circus was also a sacred space. It was dedicated to the god Consus, a deity of the granary, and the games were originally religious festivals. The central spina was crowded with shrines and altars. Before the races, priests would make sacrifices for good fortune. Victory was seen as a sign of divine favor. So, in this one place you had a perfect fusion. Religion, politics, gambling, sport, and social identity, all revolving around the visceral, deadly drama of the race. And the gambling, oh, the gambling. It was ubiquitous, from the senator betting a villa on his blue faction to the slave wagering a day's wages. Bookmakers roamed the stands. The odds shifted with every lap, every crash. Fortunes were made and lost in an afternoon. The rush of the race was amplified by the thrill of the wager, making the emotional investment absolute. To lose your bet was a personal tragedy. To win was a taste of divine blessing. The charioteers who survived and thrived became the first true celebrities in history, their fame transcending class. We know their names from inscriptions and graffiti. Gaius Appuleius Diocles, a Spaniard who drove for 24 years, won 1,462 of his 4,257 races, and retired with a fortune estimated at 35 million sesterces, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. Scorpus, who won over 2,000 races before dying young. Their faces were on lamps, their stats debated in taverns. They had groupies, fan clubs, and bitter enemies. In a society obsessed with ancestry and nobility, these men, often of slave origin, achieved immortality through sheer skill and nerve. But nothing lasts forever, not even the roar of the circus. As the Roman Empire Christianized in the 4th century, the Church condemned the games as pagan, immoral, and a wasteful distraction. The last known chariot race in Rome was held in 549 AD under the Ostrogoth king Totila. After that, the great structure was abandoned. Its marble was looted for medieval churches and palaces. Its immense bowl filled with silt and debris. What was once the heartbeat of an empire became a pasture, then a market garden. Today, it's a peaceful, grassy park in the center of modern Rome. Tourists stroll where chariots raced, hardly able to imagine the deafening, dusty, violent pageant that once filled the space. The story of the Circus Maximus is the story of Rome in microcosm. Brilliant engineering, brutal competition, sophisticated organization, raw emotion, and a desperate need for communal catharsis. It shows us a society that could build staggering monuments to collective joy and bloodlust, a society where a slave could, for an afternoon, be a god, and where an emperor had to bow to the will of the mob. It reminds us that our modern spectacles, sports stadiums, political rallies, even online communities, are echoes of this ancient need to belong, to cheer, to gamble, to lose ourselves in something bigger than ourselves. It's a powerful contrast to the intimate poison of the Borgias. Isn't it? One story is about secret sins in private rooms. The other is about public, screaming passion in the open air. History isn't a monolith. It's this incredible range of human experience. I'd love to hear what you think. Does the world of the Circus Maximus fascinate you? The danger, the politics, the sheer scale of it? Or do you find the darker, more personal intrigues like the Borgias more compelling? Drop a comment below. Just the word circus or Borgia. Let's see where the community's interest lies. If you're enjoying this journey through the grand narratives of history, you're my kind of person. We're building something here, a long-form tapestry of stories about power, plants, and people. If you want to help this channel grow, please take a second to like this video. And if you haven't yet, subscribing is the simplest way to never miss a chapter. Now let's meet the Queen. She was born in 1122 in the sun-drenched, wine-rich duchy of Aquitaine in what is now southwestern France. Her inheritance was staggering. Upon her father's death when she was just 15, Eleanor became the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, a territory larger and wealthier than the lands directly controlled by the King of France. She was the most eligible heiress in Christendom. But Eleanor was not just a deed to land. She was educated, spirited, and steeped in the culture of the Langue d'Ossy, the land of troubadours, courtly love, and a relative freedom for noble women unheard of in the stricter north. Her first marriage, at age 15, was a political inevitability, to the young Prince Louis, who weeks later became King Louis VII of France. It was a mismatch of epic proportions. Louis was pious, earnest, monkish. He had been raised for the monastery and wore the crown like a hair shirt. Eleanor was vibrant, intellectual, and hungry for life. She brought her southern court to Paris, a court filled with music, poetry, and colorful clothing that scandalized the dour northern clergy. The French court saw her as frivolous, even immoral. She saw them as boring. Despite this, she fulfilled her queenly duties, even accompanying Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147, a remarkable journey for a woman at the time. The crusade was a disaster, both militarily and for her marriage. Eleanor's uncle was Prince Raymond of Antioch, a charismatic ruler who proposed a sensible military strategy. Eleanor agreed with him, Louis did not. Rumors swirled. Whispers that Eleanor was too close to her uncle, that she questioned her husband's leadership, that she even threatened to have their marriage annulled based on consanguinity. They were distant cousins. The truth is murky, but the damage was done. The rift became a chasm. On the journey home, they traveled on separate ships. The marriage, already cold, was dead. Back in France, Eleanor demanded an annulment. Louis, humiliated and under pressure from a wife who refused to bear him a son, she had 2 daughters, finally agreed. In 1152, a church council granted the annulment on the grounds of consanguinity. Eleanor was free, but she was no safe, retired queen. At 30, she was once again the Duchess of Aquitaine, an unmarried woman controlling a third of modern France. And she moved with breathtaking speed. Just 8 weeks after her annulment, she married Henry Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Duke of Normandy. He was 19, she was 30, a scandalous age difference in reverse. He was energetic, ambitious, brilliant, and tempestuous. They were, intellectually and temperamentally, a match. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a geopolitical earthquake. Together, they controlled a vast swath of territory from the Pyrenees to the English Channel. 2 years later, Henry became King Henry II of England. Eleanor, once Queen of France, was now Queen of England. Her lands, joined with his, created the Angevin Empire, a cross-channel domain that made Henry the most powerful monarch in Europe. It was a stunning second act, born from sheer strategic audacity. For a time, it was a powerful partnership. Eleanor bore Henry 8 children, 5 of them sons, including the future kings Richard the Lionheart and John. She ruled as regent in England while Henry campaigned on the continent. She patronized the arts, fostering the legends of King Arthur and the culture of chivalry that would define the era. The court at Poitiers, in her beloved Aquitaine, became a legendary center of culture. Here, under Eleanor's influence, and perhaps that of her daughter Marie, the idea of courtly love was refined, a code where knights pledged devoted, often impossible love to noble ladies, a romantic ideal that was a world away from the brutal realities of feudal marriage. It was a game, a poetic theater, but it raised the status of women in culture, and Eleanor was its ultimate queen. But the marriage, built on mutual ambition, shattered on the rocks of Henry's infidelity and his desire to control everything, including his formidable wife. The breaking point is famously linked to Rosamund Clifford, Fair Rosamund, Henry's long-term mistress. Legends later wove tales of Eleanor discovering Rosamund in a secret bower and poisoning her. The truth is less melodramatic but more profound. Eleanor's pride and political power were insulted. Worse, Henry began to strip away her authority, trying to govern Aquitaine through her but without her. He treated their sons as political tools, promising them lands and titles but granting no real power. A smoldering resentment turned into a fire. In 1173, Eleanor did the unthinkable. She supported a rebellion by her 3 eldest sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, against their father. This was more than a family quarrel. It was a dynastic civil war. She used her networks, her resources, and her intelligence to fuel the revolt from Aquitaine. For a medieval queen to take up arms, politically, against her king was unprecedented treason. The rebellion failed. Henry's forces were too strong. The sons begged for and received forgiveness. Eleanor, however, was shown no mercy. She was captured while trying to flee, disguised as a man according to some chroniclers. Henry did not execute her. Instead, he imposed a far more subtle, crushing punishment. He imprisoned her. For the next 16 years, from 1173 to 1189, Eleanor of Aquitaine lived under house arrest in various English castles. She was not mistreated in the physical sense. She had attendants, but her world was reduced to a series of comfortable rooms. The most brilliant, powerful woman in Europe was put on a shelf, her political influence severed. Her life paused at age 51. Imagine those years. The frustration, the rage, the strategic mind turning over in silence. She was not idle. She corresponded. She maintained connections. She watched from her gilded cage as her sons grew and her husband's empire frayed. She became a living symbol of Henry's tyranny, a martyr in the eyes of her supporters. Her captivity only burnished her legend. Then, in 1189, Henry II died, defeated and broken by a final rebellion led by his son Richard, with the tacit support of the King of France. Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor's favorite, was king. His first royal act was to order his mother's release. At 67 years old, Eleanor walked out of captivity. And she didn't retire. She got to work. Richard, a brilliant warrior, was a restless king. He spent most of his reign on crusade or defending his lands in France. Eleanor, in his absence, became the true ruler of England. She toured the realm, settling disputes, raising taxes for his ransom when he was captured on his return from the Holy Land, and ruthlessly suppressing a rebellion by her youngest son, John. She was the steel in the realm's spine. When Richard died in 1199, it was Eleanor, now 77, who ensured the succession. She crossed the Pyrenees in winter to fetch her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile, to marry the French prince, securing a temporary peace. She then threw her support behind John, her last surviving son, traveling across her lands in Aquitaine to secure the loyalty of her vassals for him, despite her likely misgivings about his character. She finally retired to the Abbey of Fontevraud, where she took the veil. She died there in 1204 at the age of 82, outliving almost all of her contemporaries, her enemies, and even the empire she and Henry had built. She was buried at Fontevraud beside Henry and Richard, an eternal family reunion of fierce, conflicted souls. Eleanor's legacy is immense. She was the mother of two English kings, Richard and John, and the grandmother of others. Through her daughters, she was the ancestor of countless European royal lines. But more than that, she redefined the possibilities for a woman in power. She was not a passive queen consort. She was a political actor, a military strategist, a cultural innovator, and a survivor of the highest order. The scandals that swirled around her, the rumors on the crusade, the rebellion against her husband, were not the marks of a sinful woman, but the collateral damage of a woman acting with an agency the medieval world was unprepared to grant her. Her story brings us full circle to the themes we've been exploring. The use of image, the navigation of oppressive systems, the transformation of personal scandal into political power. She used the tools she had, her mind, her title, her wealth, and her unparalleled resilience. We have witnessed resilience in a prison tower with Eleanor. Now, let us step into the most exquisite, gilded prison ever conceived. The court of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. Here, the stones did not confine. Instead, an invisible labyrinth of ritual, favor, and meticulously crafted image held an entire aristocracy in thrall. This is not a story of a single dramatic rebellion, but of 1,000 subtle surrenders. It is the story of power so absolute it became a theater, and where the audience was compelled to live on the stage, forever performing for the sole spectator who mattered, the king. If the depth and sweep of these historical narratives is your kind of journey, you are in the right place. We are connecting dots across millennia, finding the human drama in the grand sweep of events. If you're enjoying this, please show some love with a like. It fuels this channel. And subscribing is your ticket to the next deep dive. Now let the performance begin. The year is 1661. Louis XIV is 22 years old. His father died when he was a child, and France had suffered through the chaotic civil war known as the Fronde, where nobles and parliamentarians challenged the crown's authority. The young king had been forced to flee Paris in his nightshirt. He never forgot the humiliation, the sense of a kingdom turning against its monarch. When his chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, died, the court expected Louis to appoint a new one. Instead, he summoned his ministers and made a simple, shocking declaration: "L'état c'est moi. I am the state." Henceforth, he would rule personally, directly, absolutely. And his master plan to prevent another Fronde was not to crush the nobility with an army, but to domesticate them with splendor. His tool was the Palace of Versailles. What began as his father's modest hunting lodge was transformed, over decades, into the awe-inspiring, overwhelming symbol of his power. But Versailles was more than a beautiful building. It was a psychological engine. Louis required the great nobles of France, the dukes and princes whose ancestors had led revolts, to live at court for much of the year. By bringing them to Versailles, he removed them from their provincial power bases, where they could raise armies and cultivate independent authority. He immersed them instead in a universe of his own design. Life at Versailles was a 24-hour performance with a strict, unwritten script. The etiquette. This was not mere politeness. It was a complex, hierarchical liturgy where proximity to the king's body was the only sacrament that mattered. Every action of the king's day was a public ritual, and to be invited to participate was a mark of supreme favor. The most coveted honors were the grandes and petites atres, the rights to enter the king's chamber at different stages of his morning lever, rising, and evening coucher, going to bed. Witnessing the king put on his shirt, hand him his wig, hold the candle as he retired. These were not chores. They were the highest honors in the land, fought over with ruthless intrigue. The entire day was a series of such ceremonies. The royal mealtime, where the king dined alone in front of a silent, watching court. The promenade in the gardens. The evening entertainments of balls, concerts, and plays. Every gesture, every choice of clothing, every word spoken was scrutinized. A glance from the king could make a courtier's fortune. A frown could ruin it. This constant, anxious performance drained the nobility's wealth, as they had to maintain astronomically expensive wardrobes and residences at court, and, more importantly, their political will. They were too busy vying for the honor of handing the king a napkin to think of raising a rebellion. Louis himself was the master actor in this theater. He cultivated the image of the Sun King, Apollo on earth. He was always on display, his posture perfect, his expression regally calm. He danced publicly in elaborate ballets, playing the roles of gods and heroes. He controlled his image through portraits, medals, and architecture, all broadcasting a message of divine right majesty, order, and limitless power. The man behind the image was complex, hardworking, pious in his own way, and a shrewd judge of character, but the man was inseparable from the performance. Within this gilded cage, the currency was not coin, but access and information. The court was a whispering gallery of plots and alliances. Salons hosted by influential women like Madame de Montespan, the king's mistress for a time, or the sophisticated Madame de Sévigné became hubs of influence. To navigate this world, one needed a patron, a protector close to the king. Careers were made and broken in the antechambers. A well-timed piece of gossip, a cleverly placed word, a discreetly revealed secret. These were the weapons. The stakes were not typically life and death. Outright violence was rare at Versailles. But social death, exile from court, disgrace, was a fate worse than imprisonment for many. It meant vanishing from the universe of favor, becoming a non-person. This system had a dark, mirrored underbelly, the world of secret correspondence and espionage. The king had a vast network of spies, both within France and across Europe. His famous minister of war, Louvois, and his de facto chief of police, the Marquis de Louvois, maintained this web. But the nobles spied on each other, too. Letters were intercepted, codes were used, and trusted servants were bribed. In a world where public expression was constrained by etiquette, the private letter became a vessel for real feeling and dangerous conspiracy. The most famous example is the affair of the poisons in the 1670s and 80s, a sprawling scandal that revealed a shadowy Parisian underworld of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and suspected poisoners, whose clientele reached into the highest chambers of Versailles. It suggested that beneath the glittering surface, the old, savage methods of power murder were still imaginable, breeding paranoia in the very heart of the Sun King's ordered world. Yet, for all its constraints, Versailles was also a crucible of culture that defined an era. Louis was the greatest patron of the arts in European history. He founded academies for everything from painting and sculpture to science and music. Playwrights like Molière, who mocked the very courtiers who laughed at his plays, and composers like Jean-Baptiste Lully created works that are still celebrated. The French language, manners, fashion, and artistic taste became the standard for all of Europe. The Louis XIV style in furniture, architecture, and garden design spoke of control, symmetry, and grandeur, aesthetic reflections of his political philosophy. In forcing the nobility to become an audience for high culture, he also made them its ambassadors, spreading French hegemony not by the sword, but by the cut of a coat and the turn of a phrase. The human cost of this brilliant spectacle was immense. For the peasants of France, the taxes required to fund Versailles and Louis's endless wars were crushing. For the courtiers, the price was their autonomy. They traded the real power of their feudal lands for the reflected glory of the king's presence. They became experts in the art of the curtsy and the clever bon mot, but political eunuchs. Louis had succeeded in his aim. He tamed the aristocracy. But in doing so, he created a disconnect between the ruling class and the country it was meant to govern, a rift that would, a century later, have catastrophic consequences. Louis XIV's reign lasted 72 years, the longest of any sovereign in European history. He died in 1715, as his body was transported from Versailles to the royal crypt at Saint Denis. The people of Paris are said to have cheered and celebrated in the streets. The sun had set. The grand performance was over. The audience, released from its spell, felt a mix of awe and exhaustion. The machinery of absolute monarchy remained, but the genius who operated it was gone. The court of Versailles shows us a different face of power than the chariot race or the battlefield. It is power as seduction, as psychological manipulation, as aesthetic domination. It reminds us that control can be exerted not only through fear of punishment, but through the addictive promise of reward, through the human desire for status and belonging. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he staged it. And for a long, glittering century, the world watched. We have traveled a vast distance together. We began in the primordial haze of a Stone Age campfire, where a curious plant first tangled its fate with ours. We walked with emperors and healers in ancient China, breathed the sacred smoke with Scythian warriors, and stood in the temples of India where a god favored the leaf. We saw it demonized by fear and racism, transformed into a weapon of a drug war, and then witnessed its slow, defiant return, first as a whisper of medicine, then as a roar of legal commerce and a cry for justice. We traced other threads in the human tapestry. We navigated the venomous elegance of the Borgias, where survival was an art of poison and politics. We felt the thunderous, bloody joy of the Roman circus, where an empire's heart beat to the rhythm of hooves. We stood with Eleanor of Aquitaine in her gilded prison, a queen who bent history with her will. And we performed in the endless, glittering theater of Versailles, where power was a role played under a sun king's watchful eye. Each story seemingly distinct, a plant, a family, a sport, a queen, a court, is in truth a variation on the same fundamental human themes. They are all stories about our search for transcendence, our hunger for power, our negotiation with freedom, and our enduring struggle between control and chaos. The cannabis seeker in a Neolithic tribe and the mystic in a Taoist cave were looking for the same thing: a glimpse beyond the veil of ordinary reality. The Roman plebeian screaming for his favorite color and the courtier vying for the honor of handing Louis XIV his shirt were both seeking validation, belonging, and a taste of reflected glory, a way to matter in a vast, indifferent system. Lucrezia Borgia, surviving through reinvention, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, surviving through sheer resilience, both mastered the art of navigating worlds designed to break them, using the limited agency they had to carve out a sphere of influence, even of grace. What is the unbroken thread running through all of this? It is the human desire to alter our state of being. Sometimes we do it externally, with a plant, with the adrenaline of a chariot crash, with the opiate of courtly favor, with the intoxication of absolute power. Sometimes we do it internally, through the discipline of image, the cunning of strategy, the patience of the long game. We are forever trying to escape the mundane, to feel more powerful, more connected, more alive, or simply less afraid. And with that desire comes its shadow, the fear of the altered state in others. The Chinese Confucian feared the laziness of the Taoist monk's smoke. The Roman senator distrusted the ecstasy of the plebeian mob. The church condemned the pagan joy of the races. Harry Anslinger feared the perceived rebellion of the minority cannabis user. Louis XIV feared the independent power of a noble in his own province. Every attempt to transcend, to break a boundary, is met by a force that seeks to impose order, to regulate, to criminalize, to control. Our history, then, is this eternal dance. The dance between the dreamer and the regulator, between the iconoclast and the institution, between the individual's quest for experience and the system's need for predictability. The plant's journey is the purest allegory for this dance, but we see it everywhere. The Borgia papacy was an iconoclast institution that became the very corruption it should have reformed. The circus was a regulator of social tension through chaotic release. Versailles was the ultimate institution that sought to regulate the human soul through spectacle. So, where does this long journey leave us? In the present moment, a moment of profound unraveling and reweaving. The old monolithic systems of control, the global drug prohibition apparatus, the rigid hierarchies of inherited power, the unchallenged authority of institutions are cracking. They are being challenged by a flood of information, by mobilized public sentiment, by the irrefutable testimony of lived experience, whether of a patient healed or a community devastated by incarceration. The war on cannabis is ending not with a bang, but with a patchwork of state laws, a booming industry, and a painful, ongoing reckoning with its injustices. But as one system of control recedes, new ones inevitably form. The green rush brings the threat of corporate monoculture, where the plant soul is commodified and its benefits funneled to a new elite. The quest for wellness can slide into a new kind of dogma. The tools of regulation, tax codes, licensing boards, marketing restrictions are the new architecture of control. The dance continues, just in a different ballroom. This is not a reason for cynicism. It is a call for awareness, for engaged participation. History shows us that progress is not a straight line. It is a spiral. We revisit the same core conflicts: freedom versus security, individual versus collective, innovation versus tradition, but each time at a higher level of complexity, armed with the hard lessons of the past. The story of Cannabis teaches us that demonization is a political tool, and that healing is a powerful, subversive force. The story of the Borgias and of Versailles teaches us that power corrupts, but also that image is a reality to be mastered. The story of the circus and of Eleanor teaches us that the human spirit craves spectacle and yearns for agency, and will find a way to express both, even under the most constraining conditions. We are the inheritors of all these stories. We carry the forager's curiosity, the healer's wisdom, the regulator's caution, the rebel's defiance. Our task is not to choose one over the others, but to integrate them, to build a world where the seeker's transcendence is respected but informed, where the regulator's order is just and compassionate, where the tools of power are used to repair and uplift, not to dominate and exclude. The final part of the story is the one you are living right now. It is the conversation in the comment section below. It is the vote you cast, the product you choose, the compassion you show, the history you choose to remember and learn from. We are not passive consumers of this narrative. We are its co-authors. This channel is dedicated to pulling on these historical threads, to showing how the patterns of the past are woven into the fabric of our present. If this journey has resonated with you, if it has made you see the world a little differently, then I have done my job. Please let me know in the comments, what thread should we pull on next? What hidden history, what untold story deserves this deep, long-form exploration? Your voice guides this journey. And if you want to continue as a co-author of this ongoing exploration, the simplest step is to subscribe and ring the bell. You become part of a community that values depth over sound bites, context over clicks, and the profound, messy, magnificent story of us. Thank you, truly, for your time, your curiosity, and for walking this long road. The story never ends. It just finds new tellers.